Well, first of all, it's a good capsule summary, Brian. But yeah, of course, the Silicon Valley Bank was taken over by the regulators on March 10, but you can see it coming. It was in distress. There was $40 billion, $40 billion pulled out of that bank in one day. On Thursday, March 9, the day before it was taken over, $40 billion just hit the road, just left. It was a complete collapse. And I was discussing with my editor, the managing editor of one of our publications, Strategic Intelligence. And you work a little bit in advance. And I plan to write something for our April issue on climate change. It's a big subject. And I'd outlined it. And he said, Jim, we got to do this banking crisis. I said, of course, let's put climate change down the road. We'll work on the banking crisis. So I started researching and writing on Silicon Valley banks, and then I'll get into more detail. But 2 days later, they took over Signature banks. We got 2 banks now. We got to zero in on this. It was a crypto connection, a signature. We talked more about that. And then the next day, the First Republic hanging by a thread. It's still hanging by a thread, by the way. Again, we'll go over all this in more detail. So I couldn't write fast enough because as I'm writing, the story is unfolding, and then you get all the corruption, insiders selling stock before the crash. Mary Daly, the chief regulator and president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, she's running around doing op plus and pride flag and all this. That's, it's a free country. You can do that if you like. But she wasn't running the bank, and she knew nothing about risk management. She's a labor economist, protege of Janet Yellen, who came up the ranks, but knows nothing about risk management or actually running a bank. So it just got worse. And then here comes Credit Suisse, right? The one thing I know, maybe a little before your time, Brian. There was a very popular rock celebrity writer in the 1960s named Marianne Faithfull. She had a great career, lots of hits, Mick Jagger's girlfriend, etc. But in her summary of the 60s, she said, if I wasn't there, it didn't happen. And I thought it was a very good way to put it. In her case, that was true. But I start to feel that way about financial crises. If I hadn't there, it didn't happen. I go back to the Hearst Bank collapse in 1974, which was a shock. That was back before that was a foreign exchange crisis, but highlighted the fact that when European banks closed and US banks were just opening, if you had a failure here, it never settled over here. It wasn't real-time settlement. So there was just all these open positions of a bank that had just failed. The S&L crisis in the 1980s, the Latin American debt crisis, the early to mid-1980s, the flash crash in 1987, the Mexican tequila crisis, 1994, long-term capital, Russia, 1998. I negotiated that bailout.com crash, 2007, mortgages, 2008. Everything falls apart, 2020, COVID, and now, today. I don't know if I'm a magnet for trouble, but I've seen my share of financial crises, and as an analyst, they have certain things in common. The entity is always different, the currency is always different, but the dynamics are very much the same. And the one thing I can say to our viewers is that this is not over. There's been a little bit of a sigh of relief. Stock market rallied a little bit toward the beginning of April. Okay, that's a normal reaction. But any thought that the problem has been solved, the bailout is complete. You're not going to hear more. It's just not true. There's more coming. Get ready for it. I can't tell you. I'm not going to pick a specific name. And we all know the names of the big banks that might be in distress. Is Deutsche Bank or Barclays or HSB Santander? Again, I'm not picking on any of them. I'm just saying that there are more dominoes waiting to fall. The really interesting part about this, and again, we can come back to the specifics, is that the dominoes falling is a good metaphor. If you got 100 dominoes, you knock the first one, they're all going to fall. That's just physics. So how do you stop that? How do you stop that crisis? Well, you truncate, you drop a steel wall between 2 dominoes, and this one hits the wall, and this one's still standing. But that's the bailout. But the problem is, each crisis tends to get bigger than the one before, which means each bailout gets bigger than the one before. My question that I'm wrestling with, are we now at the point where the need of bailout is bigger than the capacity of the central banks? That they pulled all the rabbits out of the hat, played all their cards. And again, this goes back to what I did say about the Silicon Valley Bank rescue. It is the biggest bailout in history, and I can explain why. But if that's the case, and what else did they? So now we're dangerously close to the point where as the crisis gets worse, it's no longer, oh, gee, let's wait for the Fed to bail it out, or let's wait for the ECB to bail it out. You get to the point, I think we're there, where you say, no, these guys actually can't stop it, and you lose confidence in the currency itself. The crisis is the dollar itself, and that goes along with that, and then that's the crisis. And there's no way to bail out a dollar crisis with dollars because you're just pumping more of what people have lost confidence in. And then where do you go? And there are good answers to that. Again, we've seen it all before. But you have to kind of take the timeline out to 1,000 years or the 1350s with the failure of the Bardi and Peru's banks in Florence to see how these things can really play out. So this is big. It's not over. The regulators will attempt more bailouts. But we're at the point where I think you can start to question the regulators themselves. Well, you make a very good point, Brian Sue. Go back to Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. The Latin American debt crisis, broadly defined in the early 1980s, that played out. The intense phase lasted about 3 years, 82, 84. It wasn't until 1990 that we got around to Brady bonds, which were the ultimate refinancing technique. But the intense period lasted about 3 years. Come forward to 1998, long-term capital management. That was about 3 months. That was July, August, September 1998. SBB was 3 days or less. It was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and done. And I talked to a guy, no reason to mention names, but runs one of the largest endowments in the world. And he said, Jim, we were moving $8 billion out of Silicon Valley Bank, and we got the wire transfer request in, but we didn't know, because you get to close business Thursday. We didn't know until Sunday that the money was going to move. We got a confirmation on Monday. We didn't end up moving the money, but there was about a 48 hours period there from Friday to Sunday when no one knew that the wires hadn't been completed. The recipients didn't have them. It was just in limbo. And it worked out. One of the big crypto promoters, well, the particular name of the bank, but they back one of the stable coins. Actually, it's USDC, had $3 billion in Silicon Valley Bank, and they talked about all these small entrepreneurs and startups. They got hundreds of employees and 5 million working capital, and that money's gone. And they're all going to fail. There was something to that. But the fact is, you had Roku, Cisco, eBay. I mean, there were huge companies with multi-billion-dollar deposits in that bank. It wasn't all a bunch of little guys. But yeah, in the old days, you had to line up around the block and maybe it was raining. You're standing there in the rain, waiting for your turn to get up to the tower. Now you can be in line at McDonald's with your cell phone, and just a couple of hits, QR code, and boom, $10 million is gone. And what Peter Thiel did, and he was right. I mean, I'm not criticizing him. He got his own money out, but he sent out like an SOS to Silicon Valley. He said, all of you, whoever you are, get your money out now. And a lot of people did. And that was that. $1 billion. The time frame is becoming more compressed because of technology. You're exactly right about that, which means that the response function has to be equally compressed, or else you are going to have all the consequences of an honest-to-goodness global financial crisis. I'm not sure if everyone knows the sequence, but on Friday night, March 10, the FDIC took over Silicon Valley Bank, and they issued a press release, and they said, here's what we're doing. We're taking over. We're putting it into what's called a receivership. Anyone with $250,000 or less, your deposits are fully insured. No worries. You'll have your money Monday morning. And over $250,000, your deposits are gone. They didn't say frozen. They didn't say suspended. They said gone. And they gave you a receivership certificate, basically an unsecured, printed up IOU from the FDIC, but not money, and it's a receivership certificate. And they said, hang on to them. In effect, we're going to sell assets. And as and when we realize proceeds from assets, we'll give you something. We'll give you distributions on these things. Don't know how much. Don't know when. We'll do the best we can. Remember in the RTC days in the early 90s? It took them 2 years, and they were very efficient. I worked with them at the time. We were in their offices. We were sitting on boxes because they didn't even have furniture, but they were doing deals. So they had the right attitude. But that took 2 years, and that was it. That's when I called the billionaire crybabies came out and forced Bill Ackman. All these guys. Oh, you got to save us. You got to trade on Bill. $5 billion is not enough. But anyway, they pounded on the White House all weekend. Now, here's something that very few people say almost nobody knew at the time except the management, although they seem to be asleep at the switch. Everyone's like, yes, startups, venture capital. There's a lot of truth to that. 97% of the deposits of Silicon Valley Bank were uninsured.